I'm not, what I've tried to do here is not present material that you can read on the websites or you can read in the strategies. And I'm going to build this around how we got to the most recent research strategy for food, which is Sustainable Healthy Agri-Food Research Plan, SHARP. And I'm going to talk about how we got there. And in doing so, it might come across in a very structured way, that it was well conceived and thought out. The reality, let me tell you, was very far from that. In terms of an overview of what I'm going to talk about, quick insight into the agri-food sector in Ireland, innovation performance in terms of Ireland and Sweden, and then getting into the nitty-gritty, getting the hands dirty in terms of behind this strategic approach to agri-food research, the origin of SHARP, developing SHARP and the impacts of SHARP, and then what I've termed the epilogue, the things that happened, things that didn't happen, the surprises that came along, and some of the challenges that we faced in developing and implementing SHARP. The agri-food sector, and thank Richard for the PR associated with Ireland. It's about the only thing we can win at the minute. We are very much an agri-food sector, and this is just the share of industrial output from the agri-foods sector. 2009 to 2012, we see a growth, but the interesting thing is it's accounting for nearly a quarter of our industrial output. And the other interesting thing, when you look at something like this, is you see that another sector where we're trying to, and as this presentation goes through, you'll see emphasis on the farmer side, the PH farmer, not the FAR farmer, and emerging of those sectors, emerging activities in those sectors. So I think we're well positioned. Down to some of the, getting into the scale of agriculture in Ireland is about 170,000 people employed in the agri-food sector. It's 26 billion turnover and more than a quarter of all manufacturing output. And the production is valued about 7 billion, but most of the revenue comes from beef and dairy, and that is reflected then in terms of the land use, for instance. I mean, most with beef and dairy, and we've got grass grows nearly 12 months of the year in Ireland. So there's a lot of land in Ireland is devoted to growing grass. There's I surprised Ingrid and Enkel last night when they said, how many farms are in Ireland? I said about 140,000. It wasn't a bad guess. There are 140,000 family farms. They're small, and a lot of those farms, the farmers have 2 jobs or 3 jobs. Most of the land area is devoted to agriculture and to the production of grass, silage and hay. I said, well, I come to Sweden, where I hadn't done this before. I'd looked into it and said, well, hang on. When I look at the innovation scorecard, I see Ireland is a follower, yet Sweden is a leader in if you look at the metrics from the EU Innovation Scorecard. And what we can see is, well, overall, Ireland isn't performing, hasn't at the same level of Sweden across these indicators. We can come to that in a second. But we're going up, and something's happening in Sweden where you're losing some of that strength. And when you look at the kind of indicators that we see, this is Ireland, and this scorecard, this performance index is made up of about 25 or so different indicators. And Ireland is below the EU average in quite a few. But if you look at Sweden, Sweden is way performing higher. And it's performing higher in the areas that really are underpinning the development of agriculture, agri-food activities in Ireland, in terms of research, the expenditure in research, the in-house innovations. So Sweden is probably well positioned. And I was thinking to myself in the plane, why is an innovation follower coming over to Sweden to talk about innovation in the agri-food sector, where Sweden is a leader? Anyway, let me have a bit of a drink here. we have never had a particularly strong strategic outlook until around the mid-90s, when we introduced the first national technology foresight exercise around 96. And that was the first time that we'd had a look forward, and it was, I think the year was might have gone through to 2030. Even the food strategies that had been evolved, that had evolved in Ireland, they started around just after the technology foresight exercise. It was a response to the technology foresight exercise. But the approaches that we've had have been very much sector-based. And that came from the foresight, because there were certain sectors looked at. And interestingly, I was reminded of it last night. One of the scenarios in the foresight exercise regarding the food and agriculture sector, and this was, say, 1990s, when we had lots of small co-ops, and we had lots of small retail outlets, and the picture was painted that come 2020, we would have no more than 3 or 4 large food companies dominating the production in Ireland. That's exactly what we have today. We would have very few retail, and the retail would be dominated by international players, and the retail sector in Ireland is dominated by Tesco, Lidl, Aldi, and one indigenous company, Dunnes Stores. But a big change took place around 2005, 2006, in this document here, Sea Change. This was the first out of the blocks, so to speak, in terms of trying to develop a research, knowledge and innovation strategy for a very diverse sector, Ireland's marine sector. It spans everything from shipping, through aquaculture, through fisheries, and then into food, and then oceanographics, fish health, animal health. And it was the first time the country had seen such a strategic approach. And the other thing about it was developed by a lot of collaboration with other agencies. Where the early food research strategies came from was within Department of Agriculture, food. Sea Change came from a multi-agency, multiple stakeholder involvement, a multi-stakeholder process, and interestingly, the expectation was that the funding of the implementation of this Sea Change strategy wouldn't just come from within the Marine Institute budget. It would come from budgets of sister agencies who were involved. So if there was a strong IT involvement in some marine technologies, you would see Enterprise Ireland funding that. If there was a health dimension to it, the Health Research Board would come on. And out of that came some success. We've also had around the same time, there was some talk of a national research prioritization exercise, and that occurred at the same time when Food Harvest 2020, which was the first real strategy for food science and technology in Ireland in 2010. And from the marine side, I put together the marine issues associated with Food Harvest 2020, and we could see there were issues there about better exploitation of looking at the marine resource as a source of ingredients rather than just a chunk of food, a piece of fish to eat. It went through, in launching 2020, it went through a lot of sector studies, and I say there was a big sector study done from the marine, and there were similar sector studies done from dairy and the like. A lot of public consultation, and it culminated with a big food summit. And interestingly, it took place in a timescale not too dissimilar from what you folks are trying to do. The National Research Prioritization exercise occurred, I said it had been talked about, and suddenly it was there. And I'll come to that again. But there was in developing the research agenda to Food Harvest 2020, what actually occurred? Food Harvest 2020 was developed. There were some talks of the research prioritization activity going on, and we said we better get something done on the research front here. How do we tie? So this document, is this a pointer as well? Oh, never know. Look, anyway, the research prioritization and the Food Research Island almost evolved together, and there was a lot of interaction. Some of the people who sat on the working group developing food research, we also sat on the working group in the research prioritization exercise. So it kind of supported Food Harvest 2020, and issues from the food and agriculture sector informed the research prioritization exercise as well. You won't see that written down anywhere. The approach that we have taken in the research prioritization exercise was that we would, and it was the agencies, the Marine Institute, the Agricultural Institute, the Environmental Institute, the research institutions themselves, were asked to put forward their views on where the strengths, where the science and technology strengths lay in respect of that particular area. And that was fed to an overarching committee in the RPE, who the Secretariat then engaged on a benchmarking exercise and said, look, we're about in this, if we're looking at prioritizing science and technology, we want to make sure we've got really good science here. And so there was an extensive benchmarking exercise done, and that was to identify where Irish research strengths lay. And in terms of picking the priority areas, there were 4 criteria. The first thing was that the science area had to be linked to a large global market, an existing market, or a market in which there was a belief that Irish-based enterprise could compete, and could compete in the long term. That the research needed was going to require public funding, or indeed to complement private funds in order to be able to realize the opportunities. Coming back to the benchmarking, that Ireland had the scientific and technological capabilities, and they were well ranked. Were we a follower? Were we a leader in a particular area? And together, the whole lot represented an appropriate way to address a national or a global challenge. And that identified 14 priority areas, and it also identifies some platform science and technologies. And a surprise to everybody when it was launched, that we had 2 strong pillars. One pillar in food for health, and the other pillar in sustainable food production and processing. What doesn't come across in this slide, and a little bit like the Dutch experience that we heard of from Alexia, was the connectivity, the interaction, the expectation that sustainable food production and processing would be building on data networks and data analytics, that it was a strong opportunity to identify some novel technological processes and novel materials that could contribute to and also come out of the priority areas. The impact in terms of the research prioritization exercise on the food research agenda was pretty immediate, in the sense of we had these two pillars, the foods for health and the sustainable food production and processing. And this was 2011 or so. And the challenge that was put down by the government, and this was an interdepartmental committee that was responsible for the research prioritization exercise, was we need to translate what are the the broad technological areas into more specific research agenda. Okay, this just set some high objectives and identified the areas, and that responsibility for developing that specific agenda came back down onto the agencies, and that ran everyone from the funding agencies for higher education through to the Marine Institute, through the lead agency in Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, Enterprise, Jobs and Employment. All these agencies were challenged, they were identified and said, you are a lead. So in the case of Foods for Health and Sustainable Food Production, the Interdepartmental Committee said, DAFM, you're responsible for developing a specific research agenda to take note of the challenges in these areas. And luckily, we had, at that stage, Food Harvest 2020, so there was a strategic vision developed for which was very, very helpful. We saw some immediate kind of impacts coming through, and I'll come back into some bigger ones later on. But in 2013, there was 30 million put into food-related research in sustainable food production and processing and foods for health. And out of the 32 million that was awarded from within the department, we could see that 30 million of that went into these two particularly thematic areas. So that process brought a focus to specific areas. And the departments then said, well, whoops, we better do this, we better put some money into it. That's what we've been told to do, and that's what happened. So if we look at the origin of SHARP, Food Research Ireland, as I say, it grew alongside the research prioritization exercise. But SHARP, and it's a very good acronym because it is sharp in the sense of very precise and pointed into the area. It was a government decision that we were going to implement the research prioritization exercise. And the minister himself for Science, Technology and Innovation chaired a high-level action group. And that particular theme of a minister chairing a group cascaded over into food and agriculture. So we had our own minister, Minister Simon Coveney, who was Minister for Food, Agriculture and the Marine. He chaired the action group and was there in touch with things from day one. Okay, he didn't get to every meeting, but when there was a big decision, when there was an event, he was there, and when the thing was launched, he was there as well. So agency responsibility was assigned to the department. A multi-agency working group was established, and the targets for the research came from what we had there in terms of the strategy from Food Harvest 2020. And the vision in Food Harvest 2020, we had seen three themes. And again, it's interesting to look at neighbour countries that they have these similar things. Themes. Acting smart, and this is the vision from 2020. Acting smart, thinking green, and achieving growth. And there's a research dimension across those as well. Okay, rolling up our sleeves and getting into the muck here now. How do we get there? In delivering SHARP, we relied an awful lot in the first instance in terms of trying to get the high-level objectives from what I've termed here our strategic intelligence, all the background documents that have been developed, not just those associated with the sustainable food and foods for health, but other documents, so materials, advanced technologies, data, ICT and the like. And then all the other sectoral documents were looked upon as being the information base, because we wanted to build upon evidence, and the evidence was built in this lot. And making sense of this material, supplemented by agencies going out and speaking to some of their customers, contributions from the research community, led to some very high-level actions being identified from within this sense-making activity. And this was being done on a Foods for Health pillar and on sustainable food production and processing. So we had two pillars here, and we were doing this. And we were looking at the implementation. Who was going to do what? Who was going to coordinate? So early on in the process, we identified responsibilities. We identified specific tasks, and we'd seen what were the issues around funding and the like. The stuff you don't see, this is straight out of the high level, and to show where we came from. Within Foods for Health, we had about 20 or so different, we have a number of different items, different high-level actions. And this is an example that and this has received the endorsement of the Minister, that the funding departments and agencies will work together and you'll define a specific research agenda. There was no one going to be missing out on here. You were all going to have, there was no running away from it. You were going to have there was going to be a collective responsibility for doing this. There was a very clear deliverable. There were going to be specific benefits that we could see. And there was a lead organisation appointed to look after the whole process. And the support was going to be there. Again, no agency could say, I'm not part of it, I don't have time. You've been mandated by your minister that you will be involved in the process. And it was that kind of support, I think, and I'll say it later on, it was that kind of support that was really responsible for what we see as a particular successful approach. And that's similarly then in terms of developing this national strategic Foods for Health research agenda with the following needs, and it identified some of those needs. But interestingly, it was about a single unified Foods for Health strategic research agenda. It wasn't the Health Research Board going to do something about nutritional performance. It wasn't the Health Research Board going to just do something about health issues, obesity, and the like. This was going to be an integrated process. And we had guiding us, we had a National Agri-Food Research and Innovation Group, NAFRI. And as a member of that group, I had two roles. I was a member of that group, but also member in some of the detail as well. But that group had oversight of the entire process. It provided guidance. Where there was a question, where there was an issue, where we needed approval, they considered and gave approval. We had identified, again coming from an amalgamation of concepts within RPE, Food Research Ireland, and Food Harvest 2020, that competitiveness, sustainability, and citizen customer issues and driven, and were the overarching principles of where we were going to go with the strategy. And probably one of the best things that we ever did on NAFRI was a decision to merge sustainable food production and processing with Foods for Health into a common research agenda. At a practical level, it meant that we weren't duplicating activities, but more importantly, it meant that we had this integration of science, technology with markets, and effectively the same industry constituency that were going to be involved. So it was a productivity issue as much as anything else for ourselves in delivering this. The process, this looks wonderful. It's so logical. And this is where I say it beggars belief when I look at this and I said, we were really good like this? No, we weren't. But this is a good way of saying it. we had the NAFRI group, who both worked to and informed the department in terms of the department-led research prioritization action group, which some of us from NAFRI sat on that group. And we had identified early on that if we were going to move forward, we couldn't really just rely upon the information base, the intelligence base that we had developed or that was there from past strategies and like. We had to engage further afield, and we had to try to identify, what were could we get some confidence in terms of the high-level actions, and we went to an external consultation. And wherever we do this in Ireland, we go to external consultation in terms of research agendas and the like. There's a challenge, and the challenge it's here in this room as well. It's dominated by agencies. There's very difficult to get industry involvement, but the overfill in the room is the researchers themselves, because they see that this is an insight into some future money coming into their area. But it was good because we went out and we did this in a formal sense in terms of workshops and the like. But we went out and we had a website, and I think we got about. We were very kind of benevolent, I suppose, in a way. We said, look, tell us what you want to do. What are your research issues? What's the science behind this? So we didn't say it's going to come from a department of botany in a particular university. We said, we wanted a botanist to make a contribution. We wanted a geneticist to make a contribution. So we got all these contributions, and we ended up in the hundreds of ideas for projects, for themes, and then, as ever, all the reasons why it won't work in terms of the issues. So that external consultation, it came back down into PAG, and we set up 3 separate working groups. And for my sins, because the marine is a very small component of the overall agri-food sector, I ended up sitting on each of those 3 groups: food production, food processing, and foods for health. Quite honestly, it was to make sure that nobody was going to forget the marine. We were going to have our say, we were going to be listened to, and we were going to make sure that issues relating to food and foods for health, where there was a link to the marine, would be either highlighted as a specific topic or integrated within a broader topic. So rather than talking about breeding of cattle or new breeds of sheep or improving the stock of the pork, we said about animal breeding. And animal breeding meant fish was included in there. When we spoke about animal welfare, we were just as concerned about fish swimming around in cages on the west coast of Ireland as we were in sows on a farm in County Cavan. And that generic approach we saw as giving opportunities to the research community to write the best proposals. Those 3 working groups validated a lot of the action and did a filtering exercise and came down to define some specific thematic areas. We identified what were termed as high-level objectives, not unlike, again, the Netherlands, and then identified some priority research and innovation areas. And on those groups, the groups were food production was led by an agricultural scientist. The food processing, that was an agricultural scientist based in Teagasc, which was the National Food and Agricultural Institute. The food processing working group, and these working groups would have had 15, 20 people on them, and they would have met half a dozen times. The food processing group was led by the head of R&D from one of the big the dairy co-ops, or big food ingredients companies in Ireland. And Foods for Health was the professor of Food Research Institute in University College Dublin, who'd been involved in nutraceutical developments. So we had those three constituents. We had the agency, we had the research performers, and we had industry represented on those groups. Are we on time? Are we okay? Yeah. That identifying those areas, we looked across sectors as well. So what are not only the specific research issues within food production, but what do we need to underpin? What were the kind of core technologies that needed to be developed? And what, again, very much like what was happening in the UK and the Netherlands, the importance of being able to interrogate, large-scale, collect and interrogate large-scale data sets, remote sensing opportunities and things like that. A lot of the environmental issues came in there because the environmental, as far as we were concerned, were cutting everything from the sustainability of the production base, but also sustainability of the supply chain, and also minimizing waste and the like. And we saw those as cross-cutting issues. And then there was a first draft produced, and that first draft went to NAFRI and to DAFM, and we reviewed where we come from. We reviewed the structure, and interestingly, we were pushing. There was an expression that we were pushing an open door. It was easy because they'd been involved, so we could see a smooth transition into a final document, which was SHARP. And the structure of SHARP is across 9 pillars. And the first three of those we see very much in the production side of agri-food. So animal production, horticulture, crops, and then managing of the natural resources. The food production processing strand was in food process technology, food product development, and the various sciences that support that activity, and then the integrity of the food chain. We have been particularly good in Ireland in terms of where there's a fault, we identify it, we trace it, we get back to a solution. We've had our hiccups, but we've dealt with them. And we've dealt with them very well. And we have a very good record in food safety. And then the other two strands, functional foods and health, and the whole diet-related disease, nutrition, the consumer side of health, fitted into the strand on Foods for Health. But it came together. And then we had identified what kind of the skill needs were required, the kind of infrastructures that we had. And that was interesting because it pointed, when we look at the infrastructure, it's pointed to suggestions that we should begin to integrate certain things. We should form more networks. We should encourage far more collaboration so that we're not duplicating infrastructure, and we're also enhancing the utilization of the asset base that's there as well. We're getting more productive out of it. And then, as I said earlier, there was the cross-cutting issues. And these are the only things I've cut out. I've picked out kind of the sustainable management of our natural resources and the climate change and the boundary issues there, because it's a good example of how a sector like the marine was able to influence. Small as we were able to influence the high-level objectives, but more importantly, we were also able to see written down and get the affirmation from the high level, the approval that understanding Ireland's wild seaweed resource and other marine biodiversity was important in terms of managing the resource. So from these priority themes, we could then see opportunities for new research projects. And the other thing about having this in front of us is that it shows the influence of a relative, and the importance and the potential of a relatively small, largely underutilized natural resource in Ireland, which is the marine resource, and having that embraced within a national food research and innovation strategy. And importantly, you'll see if you were to go through Food Harvest 2020, or if you were to go through FoodWise 2025, you will see the marine identified as an opportunity area. And we had very clear expected impacts, and they were traceable. There was something tangible about the impact. They had to support our deployment of the national kind of marine, the water frameworks and marine strategy framework, support the EU biodiversity strategy, our own national biodiversity plan. So those were the expected impacts. But what were the tangible results of this process that we've gone through? And I say it came across quite logical maybe to us, but reality far from that. Well, between 2010, and this is over the life of this new strategic approach, we've seen 95 million invested in R&D, specifically related to crop and animal breeding, aquaculture, sensory sciences, food safety, marine functional ingredients. We were behind in 2007 when we launched Sea Change, which is the marine research and innovation strategy. We put forward a proposal that we would build a national capability to develop functional ingredients from marine sources. And I met with an awful lot of opposition that, you know, even our parent department didn't recognize fish as food. That was something else. The only food that we had in Ireland was on the land. That program received nearly €6 million and leveraged a further €6 million from other funding activities, and it's still ongoing. We had Enterprise Ireland, which is the indigenous industrial development agency, specific responsibility for food. They invested 15 million in food industry projects, but they leveraged an extra 60 million from industries. 2 minutes, yeah. Major collaboration occurred across and building on some of the scientific strengths. We've established a Food for Health Technology Centre with 40 million, most of that from the state, and we've now plans for the dairy technology and beef technology centres have been developed as well. In terms of the impacts, we now have regular open research calls for proposals. We've joint funding between the major agencies, Science Foundation Ireland, the Health Research Board and the Marine Institute. We've created critical mass in functional foods for both dairy and marine, in bioprocessing and public health. And we've got a lot of industry-driven investments. Glanbia have put in place a new research and development centre. We have a company called Biomarine Ireland with 50 million of foreign investment to identify and produce nutritional compounds from fish. But importantly, you will see that we've also got now a very rigorous performance and evaluation review process in place. And published quite recently, and you'll pick it up on the DAF website, is the review of food progress under Food Harvest 2020. Some of the research issues have been are now reflected in FoodWise. So those are, you can come and talk to me during lunch or whatever about some of these, but food research is a priority. Does the process work? Yes, it's working. What were the issues? A lot of sector rivalry, but we spoke about some of that and we overcame it. We had to deal with pet projects being included in it. The big challenge of Is it applied? Is it basic? Where should we be going? Institutional rivalry, protection of budgets and the like. But importantly, what comes through this process, and it's great to be able to stand here and say this, but I'm not a member of DAFM, and I don't know the minister particularly well, but the success is attributed to the efficiency of our civil servants in driving the detail forward, and the support from the minister, because without that we would not be where we are now. And SHARP has most definitely resulted in far more precise targeting of a limited budget into research. In fact, we've got, as you know, we've gone through an economic crisis, and there was an embargo on public sector recruitment, except research. Where it could be justified, posts were sanctioned, and that carried all the way through, and that's undoubtedly helped us. So with that, just to thank you all.